name is Brian Richardson. I'm with the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications here at Washington & Lee, for those of you who don't know me. Again, I'm delighted that you could all join us today for our lecture, Help Wanted, A New Generation of Journalists, by our Reynolds Distinguished Visiting Professor Tom Mattesky. Tom's professorship and today's program are made possible by a grant from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation, to which we are deeply grateful. If you'll forgive me a bit of self-indulgence, I'll say initially that Tom and I go back a long way. I graduated from the department in 1973, Tom in 1974. I taught him everything he knows. We used to share airtime, true story, on WLUR-FM with other wannabe broadcasters, one of whom I recall thought it was okay to yawn during his newscast because nobody could see him. You could hear him yawn. Our university photographer, Patrick Heinley, was part of that cabal as well. And our education was overseen by the demanding but patient, very, very patient Ron McDonald, God rest his soul. We owe him much, which fortunately has never included reimbursement for fines that could have been levied on numerous occasions by the Federal Communications Commission because of our on-air behavior. I'm delighted that Pat McDonald could join us today to hear what Tom has to say, and I'm equally delighted that Ron's distinguished career as a newsman and teacher have been recognized by his selection for induction this spring into the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. The ways of doing news have changed hugely since 1973, but I hope the fundamentals of doing news responsibly have not changed, because for me, the future of news is the future of democratic society, of the right and ability of people to practice self-determination and self-governance based on the availability of reliable information and a public forum to speak truth to power. Tom Mattesky is uniquely qualified to help our students understand how all that sifts out in this troubling and scary new world. Tom oversaw the daily news gathering efforts of CBS News in Washington for 12 years. As Deputy Washington Bureau Chief from 1995 until his retirement in 2007, he managed a staff of nearly 200 correspondents, producers, and technicians, overseeing daily coverage of the White House, Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, and the Supreme Court for one of the world's premier broadcast news organizations. Before that, he spent 2 years as a producer for CBS News' Eye on America segment. He also spent 4 years as the network's chief White House producer during the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He has worked with correspondents including Dan Rather, Leslie Stahl, and Bob Schieffer. He also spent 4 years as a field producer based in Charlotte, North Carolina and Atlanta, and also worked for network affiliates in Charlotte and Roanoke. He spent 1 year after graduation with a newspaper in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Tom won an Emmy in 1987 for investigative reporting for stories exposing problems with the nation's medical helicopter programs. In his course this term, Saving Television News, Tom is putting our students in the middle of the debate about how to do that, as viewers abandon traditional newscasts and revenues shrink. He has also been helping us guide our students in our converged multimedia reporting and producing classes. Every Thursday, he crawls into the bunker with us at 1 p.m. as our students on deadline produce the weekly Rockbridge Report. That's rockbridgereport.wlu.edu. Check it out. The television broadcast and multimedia website. In all of his efforts with us, Tom has contributed immeasurably to our students' education and professional experiences. I'm sure what you are about to hear from him will too. Please join me in welcoming Tom Mattesky.
Brian, thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for the opportunity to come to Reed Hall every day. I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed the last couple of months and how much I'm looking forward to the next couple of months as well. It really is fun again to go to work. And thank you for bestowing such an impressive title on an old reporter, the Reynolds Distinguished Visiting Fellow in Journalism. It's got a nice ring to it, doesn't it? One of my classmates from my W&L days told me recently that he always wanted to know a distinguished fellow. I guess he does now, thanks to Brian Richardson. It's fitting that Brian mentioned our former professor, Ron McDonald, in his introduction. Ron steered both of us into careers in journalism and helped us develop a passion for the news which burns in both of us today. If there is a downside to my return after 35 years, it's, as Brian mentioned, that Ron McDonald isn't here. Ron died last year, but not before I could tell him that the university had entrusted me with a 12-week teaching mission to convince a new generation of journalists that television news should be saved and that good journalism is essential to the survival of our democracy. Ron wished me luck, and he said, "You'll do great." That's something I've tried to tell my students every opportunity I've had. They will do great. Some of them may not know it now, but they all will do great. Ron McDonald was a no-nonsense, hard-nosed journalist. The only thing he liked more than a stiff drink and a regular smoke was a good story. In his classroom inside Reed Hall, he taught his charges to be ethically and morally uncompromising, and he instilled in us a belief that the search for the truth mattered. Ron disdained celebrity journalism. In his mind, reporters had important work to do, and their opinions and their celebrity would only get in the way of their real mission of reporting the facts and digging for the truth. Some 25 years ago, after witnessing a growing proliferation of journalists spouting opinions on television talk shows, Ron remarked to me that journalism is in a sad state of affairs when reporters are interviewing other reporters. Ron McDonald had not only found a good story, but also a disturbing development in the profession he and I loved. Supposedly objective reporters were showing up regularly on television, expressing opinions about the very issues and individuals they were assigned to cover. Forget about objectivity and forget about fairness. This was just the beginning, but the rules of journalism were changing, and Ron McDonald knew they were not changing for the better. In fact, since Ron's observation, American journalism has stumbled, bumbled, and even misled. Fabrication and plagiarism have rocked this industry from its smallest outlets to its celebrated titans. The watchdogs of the opinion makers have become the lapdogs of their own agendas, and the search for the truth too often has been lost in the process. With apologies to my Reed Hall colleagues and to those non-students in the audience, I'm here this afternoon to talk to the W&L students, the new generation of journalists, the people that I see working so very hard every day in Reed Hall. Simply put, journalism desperately needs your help. My friend and longtime colleague at CBS, Bob Schieffer, remarked recently to me that he can't remember a time when there have been more challenges facing journalists. The corporations which own our news divisions have cut our staffs, they've slashed our budgets, and they've held us to the same profit expectations as other divisions within their corporations, ones that produce entertainment programming or even washing machines and dryers. In most newsrooms today, public service has taken a backseat to profits and the bottom line. Today's newsroom managers may blame their cost-cutting measures on the economy, but that's convenient cover because this reign of irresponsibility was going on when Wall Street was booming and when 401ks were flush with profits. It's nothing new. As if that weren't bad enough, in the wake of 9/11, our government has taken unprecedented steps toward conducting its business in a shroud of secrecy. Many of our leaders, while constantly praising our founding fathers, have forgotten that democracy, by its most basic definition, means openness. Out of Washington these days, we're hearing a lot of talk about transparency. Perhaps a new day is dawning. But I'm skeptical, and you all should be skeptical as well, because we have heard this talk before. All of these things are happening at a time when the world has never been more connected, and the communications tools available to journalists have never been more numerous or more powerful. With a simple keystroke or a flip of the switch, our stories now are sent around the world, and not into only homes and cars, but into handheld devices and into places that not long ago were known as the darkest and deepest ends of the earth. It's a challenging and opportunistic time for journalists, and for journalists to be like you. But along with this grand opportunity comes a very heavy burden, and fair or unfair, that burden will be placed solely on your shoulders. And frankly, your help can't come soon enough. At a time when news and information are traveling so rapidly, so too are lies and misinformation. And my generation of journalists has not done enough to separate the truths from the untruths, and our readers and viewers have suffered because of that. We need your help to do a better job. 35 years ago, when I began my reporting career, journalists were held in such high esteem that only a few occupations, like firefighters and members of the clergy, were more admired. Many viewed us as public servants, entrusted with the noble duty of pursuing the truth. Reporting about Watergate and the Vietnam War helped guide this country through some of its darker days. And the public recognized the efforts of hardworking reporters who pried open closed doors and forced government and the military to operate in the light of public scrutiny. Unfortunately, that perception has changed. Our place in the rankings of most admired professions has plummeted. The last time I looked, only politicians, lawyers, and I think some big-time bankers were less trusted than journalists, and our lead on them was shrinking. Somehow, over the last 3 decades, this profession has lost its way, it's lost its standards, it's perhaps even lost its vision, and it's going to take the talents of a new generation of journalists, your generation of journalists, to right the ship. We need your help to do a better job. 2 former presidents of the Society of Professional Journalists, Clint Brewer and Christine Tatum, recently wrote that news organizations and individual journalists very much have themselves to blame for the public's shrinking confidence in their work. We have pandered too often to the sensational and the shocking, they wrote, and we have participated too willingly in schemes that blur information and news with entertainment and commercial promotion. They could have added almost no news organization, large or small, has been an exception, and that most journalists have stood by as guilty bystanders, forgetting that the First Amendment is about the rights of our readers and our viewers and not about us. Over the last decade, almost every major newspaper and every television network, the very pillars of this profession, have dealt with the consequences of shoddy, incomplete, and in some instances, fabricated reporting. The abuses have become so rampant, so common, that our readers and our viewers seem to expect us to behave irresponsibly. Andy Schatz, who's the Ethics Committee Chairman of the Society of Professional Journalists, wrote last month that one amazing detail to emerge from the Jason Blair reign of plagiarism and fabrication at the New York Times was how disconnected readers and sources said they felt. Even after sources quoted in Blair's articles read made-up facts about themselves and manufactured quotes they never uttered, they didn't alert the newspaper. They simply felt no one would listen. That can't continue. We need your help to do a better job. Unfortunately, the problems don't end there. My generation of journalists has granted anonymity too far, too often, and too freely to too many sources. As the New York Times found out last year when it published an investigation based on unnamed sources of John McCain's alleged relationship with a female lobbyist, the public now demands more evidence than just anonymous sources. By relying so heavily on anonymous sources, my generation of journalists has watched many potentially important stories get clouded in totally separate debates about a news organization's intentions and its own standards. This can't continue. Somehow, this profession has forgotten that we have a duty not only to champion the rights of the press, but its responsibilities as well. But all is not hopeless. We have just experienced a presidential election for the history books, and readers and viewers have turned in record numbers to American journalism for information and facts, and perhaps more importantly, for context and perspective. Americans' appetite for news hasn't diminished, it has increased. The behemoths of the print and broadcast worlds may be crumbling, but there are strong signs that niche media and news-on-demand sites are thriving and expanding online and elsewhere. The landscape and platforms may be changing, but there is, and I firmly believe always will be, a demand for good journalism. Our democracy simply wouldn't survive without it. But the main reason I'm hopeful is because of you. After 2 months in Reed Hall's classrooms and other settings around this campus, I've seen how smart, how caring, and how hardworking you are. You are W&L's finest, and I swell with pride to call you my students. With your help, journalism can regain its luster and its reputation, and more importantly, perhaps it can regain the public trust. And as any good teacher, I have some suggestions about how you can prepare for this very important mission. Make your pursuit of knowledge a never-ending crusade. Take advantage of the offerings of other departments here at Washington and Lee. Knowing the elements of science and math and knowing history, as well as other disciplines, will serve you well as journalists. And after graduation, challenge your minds by continuing to read and continuing to think. When he founded the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote that the true purpose of an education was to give a man enough knowledge to know whether his liberty was being threatened or whether his liberty was being secured. To put it more simply, use knowledge to help you think critically and analytically. The best journalists I know think critically and analytically, and they think critically and analytically every day. Learn a foreign language. If news organizations really are to serve an increasingly multicultural society and understand a global economy, we need reporters and editors who are bilingual or even multilingual. The ability to speak Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and other languages increasingly is in demand at virtually every news organization I know, and that demand is only going to grow. Embrace technology. You have state-of-the-art facilities here at Washington and Lee. Take advantage of them. Don't wait to learn on the job. It will be too late. And when you finally do get on the job, use technology to help you enlighten and inform your audiences. There are great new tools coming to market every day to enrich and enhance reporting. My generation was too skeptical, too lazy, perhaps too hesitant to embrace them. Don't let that happen to you. Get involved with campus media. Apply what you're learning in your journalism and mass communications classes to jobs on the Phi, on the Trident, and other campus media. There is no better preparation than hands-on experience. And if you don't think campus media are real with the same struggles and challenges facing their professional counterparts, just ask your friends on the Trident staff. They learned hard lessons last year about the responsibility of free press, free speech, and an independent press. Secure an internship. That's why my friend Bill Foy from Channel 13 is here. Despite my generation's failings, there still is much you can learn from those in America's newsrooms. If you really have a passion to do this important work, internships will help you identify mentors who you can turn to for guidance when you face the inevitable ethical and moral questions that all journalists will confront in their careers. Believe me, you will confront moral and ethical dilemmas in your careers. Think of journalism as public service. Those of you who are seniors may remember the convocation address that was delivered your freshman year. W&L graduate and Justice Department lawyer Mark Bradley challenged you to consider careers in government and service to others. I know Mark well, and he would be the first one to tell you that good journalism is public service. There is nothing more important to our democracy than informed citizens. If it's done right, a life in journalism can be a life in public service, and it can be a very good and fulfilling life as well. Know your mission and set high standards for yourselves. It's fairly simple, really. The job of a journalist hasn't changed since I sat in Ron McDonald's classes more than 3 decades ago. Search for the truth, and when you find it, report it in a straightforward manner and in words that people can understand. And if you make a mistake, correct it right away. Correct it as quickly as you possibly can. There is no better defense of our mission, and there's no better sign of our commitment to the truth. Not long ago, the legendary Watergate reporter Bob Woodward was asked whether he and his colleague Carl Bernstein had an agenda when they began the Watergate story, and also whether they had any idea how it might turn out. No, Woodward said, they had no agenda, and of course they had no idea how the story would turn out. All we were trying to do, Woodward said, was find out what happened. If Bob Schieffer, my wise friend at CBS News, had his way, those 4 words would be posted over the newsrooms of every news organization in this country. Find out what happened. As Bob sees it, there's no better way to sum up what we as journalists do, and I simply couldn't agree with him more. I hope as you embark on your careers in this very noble profession, you will remember those 4 simple words. Find out what happened. If you accept this as your charge, and if you're up to the challenge, as I'm very confident that you are, then our democracy will be safeguarded, and perhaps trust will be returned to a profession which desperately needs your help. And if my mentor and former Professor Ron McDonald were issuing this charge today, he'd add one more thing. You'll do great, and I know you will. Thanks very much. I think part of the routine is to entertain questions. So if you have anything you'd like to throw at me or at Brian or at any of my colleagues in Reed Hall, we'll be happy to answer the questions for you. Laura? I think we'll have to continue this discussion after the allotted time. I'm one of the guilty bystanders. I am one that stood by as things happened in the news business within CBS News itself. I can go down the litany, the National Guard story. There are other examples, holding the Abu Ghraib story for a couple of weeks. Now, these are not stories that I was directly involved with in terms of making the final decision, but I knew what was going on, and the stories still aired or were delayed. Yes, I bear responsibility, and unfortunately, that's something that I'll carry with me the rest of my life. If I heard your question correctly, you're a little far back there. How globalization of journalism is. I think the simplest way to answer that is that journalism really isn't poised to cover the global economy and what's going on around the world right now. One of the real problems with the economic cutbacks that we've seen in news organizations recently has been the demise of international news coverage and really the disappearance of international news bureaus. When I joined CBS News in the 1980s, we had bureaus in places like Warsaw and Nairobi and Bangkok, and I don't even think someone from CBS News has been in Bangkok, Nairobi, or Warsaw probably in the last 5 years. So what we are doing now, and many of those in my class know this, American journalists now are covering stories overseas, but they're covering them from listening posts in places like London or even New York or Washington or, Lord knows, perhaps even here in Lexington. But as we know, or as my students know from my class, without having reporters on the ground in places around the world, we really can't give an accurate depiction of the global economy or efforts that are going on globally. And I think that's one of the real sad tragedies of what we're seeing in news organizations right now. My class also knows that the research that's done by the networks and the major news organizations shows that Americans don't care about international coverage or foreign events unless they affect America. That's why you will generally see stories about Afghanistan or Iraq, but you likely will not see stories about inflation and suffering in places like Zimbabwe. Catherine? I think you market yourself simply as someone who is not afraid to embrace technology, someone who has very high standards for your work and your ethics, and also someone that is not afraid to work hard. I don't think that's changed a lot from what I experienced and what Brian experienced when we left here 35, 36 years ago. I think what has changed is that there really are no walls anymore. The journalism today, working in a journalistic organization, working in a newsroom now, is just that. It's working in a newsroom. It's no longer working for a newspaper or working for a television organization, working for a radio organization or a wire service. You're working for multi-platforms now. And in terms of marketing yourself, just simply stress and sell the skills that you're learning here at Washington & Lee, and take advantage of those skills to market yourself in a way that news organizations know that you not only can do all of these things, you can do them well and you're not afraid to do them. And most importantly, unlike those my age, you won't complain about doing them. Ned? It's exactly why I retired at 55. It's very tough. You will be surrounded in the news organizations you work with very good people who have the same high standards that you do. Unfortunately, in newsrooms these days, the problem is not about audience, it's about revenue. And so there are others that are making decisions, whether it's on the, if you will, the print end from the publisher's office, or if it's at the network level from the suits and the sales and marketing departments. It's tough when those walls begin to crumble, and that's one of the reasons that forced me to leave when I left. I didn't have the same passion to continue in the work that I was doing at the same level I was doing, because all I wanted to do was cover the news and report the news, and I was being asked to do so much more. Cameron? I think you can just be as vigilant as possible. I think you're already beginning to see this. Some of the students in my class know that there was a question right after the inauguration that asked me when the Love Fest would end, when the news organizations would begin keeping a closer eye on the administration. And we're already beginning to see that there are cracks in this administration already, and I fully expect to see many more cracks before it even reaches its 100-day point. We've heard the talk, as I said, about transparency before. Be very, very skeptical about it. If an administration tells you one thing as a journalist, hold that administration to its word, and if it doesn't deliver, remind that administration what words it has spoken. And that's the best thing you can do, is just do good, honest reporting. The best reporting that's done in Washington, D.C. isn't the exciting stuff that you see on television, or the big events like a State of the Union speech or a joint address to Congress or an inauguration. It's the everyday beat work that's done in places like the White House or the State Department or the Pentagon or on Capitol Hill, where you have reporters who know those beat areas, work very hard to understand what's going on and point out things that are wrong. And that's the good work that's being done in Washington. It's getting harder to do that with the budget cutbacks that have come up. And it used to be that most organizations would double or triple team most beats. Now some beats, like the State Department beat, are not covered by most news organizations. So it's getting harder and harder to do it. But that's one of the areas where, if you embrace technology, there are ways that good news coverage can continue and actually can expand if we're not afraid to embrace technology. And I think part of the problem that we're doing right now is part of the problem we're experiencing right now is that news organizations are asking guys my age and Brian Richardson's age to embrace technology, and we're not only not very good at it, we're kind of surly on top of that. And so it makes it more difficult. You guys aren't afraid of that stuff, and Cameron, that can only make you a better reporter. If you use these tools wisely, they can enhance and even enliven the reporting that you're doing. And that's something that you must keep in mind. But I think it's crucial to continue to keep your eye on the ball, no matter how many budget cuts there are or how many fewer reporters are working at the State Department or on Capitol Hill or elsewhere. Adam? It's like the Rockbridge Report, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. I think that's a line that I really lately have had trouble drawing. My last 2 years at CBS News were spent pretty much fielding phone calls in the middle of the night about reports on blogs or web pages I had never heard of, about everything from Ronald Reagan's death 3 years before he died, or to invasions of Iraq before they happened. The biggest problem that's happening right now, in my mind, Adam, is that good reporters in places like Washington, places like the Justice Department, they're so tied up trying to shoot down someone else's reporting or confirm someone else's reporting that they are not reporting themselves. And so that's one line that has really, I think, been very difficult to draw and really, I think, hasn't been drawn. And I think the other one is that it's just always going to be the competitive nature of news, that if someone else has a big story, your organization is going to demand that you have this right now. And it's worse these days because of technology, as you said, because you used to be able to wait, if CBS News broke something at 6:30 at night, the New York Times or the Washington Post still had an 11 o'clock deadline or some deadline later in the night to get that on the front page of the Washington Post. Now it needs it for WashingtonPost.com. And so what we're seeing, unfortunately, is in all news organizations now, we're seeing what has happened for the last decade or so with cable television news. And that is that things are being reported which, frankly, are wrong, and they're never corrected. And it's happening more and more on websites. I mentioned WashingtonPost.com. It has both a storied history and some very good reporting, but some very irresponsible reporting as well. Jacob? I think it certainly has wounded the industry. There's no question about that. But I think in some respects those wounds are self-inflicted. And the 24-hour, we need to look at the 24-hour cable opportunity as just that. It's an opportunity. I want more news coverage. I want more outlets for the stories that I'm doing. Too much these days in America's network newsrooms and the large newspapers, too much time is spent arguing over things that have nothing to do with journalism or reporting. And I mentioned in class today that if you watch the CBS Evening News tonight, there will be 6 or 7 stories that will be on the air, but there also will be 6 or 7 stories that didn't make the air that night. Cable news or a 24-hour outlet for your product is a place to put that news, or the internet. And we need news on demand. You know that viewers your age, news consumers your age, don't watch the work that I was doing. Those in my class know that the average person who watches one of the evening newscasts of the networks, the profile is perfect for all. It's no different for all three, ABC, NBC, and CBS. The average viewer is a 61-year-old woman. She watches news once a week, and if she watches more than once a week, she doesn't watch the same newscast. So our mission in newsrooms these days is twofold. We're trying to, instead of reporting the news, we're trying to get that 61-year-old woman to watch us more than one night a week. And we're trying to get 18 to 34-year-olds to watch us at all. And I think sometimes that we're insulting both, that if we simply would just go out and do good reporting and practice good journalism, I think the numbers and the viewers would follow. Maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm idealistic, but I think we're too caught up in gimmicks. We've talked in our class, you brought it up today, we have to put a bumper sticker on everything. It's like we can't even believe that our viewers are smart enough to know what they're seeing and hearing. And I think if we just got back to solid reporting, we have to use technology, and it has to be interesting. It has to be well shot. It has to be well edited. It has to be well written. But it also has to be good journalism. If we spend more time doing that and less time worrying about that 61-year-old woman who watched ABC last night and the 18 to 34-year-olds who aren't going to watch us on television anyway, we need to get on another platform to reach them. I think we'll be okay. Well, no, I hope you will find a trusted source you can listen to, and I think there are some out there. And that is one of the other challenges, I think, facing networks and wire services and the traditional, the big city newspapers today is this is a great opportunity because people want sources of news they can trust. That's why we tune to, it's why you get a particular newspaper or why that 61-year-old woman watches that particular network. She believes what she's watching is something she can take to the bank. And that's what we need to get back to. We talked in our class today, we showed Katie Couric spent more time on Letterman on Monday than she did reporting or working for the CBS Evening News. Now I signed my contract leaving CBS to give me a pension said I can't criticize CBS, but that's not criticism, that's fact. So yes, we need to, if we get back to the things that I mentioned to Jacob, that if we keep our eye on the ball and do good reporting and put people on television that you can trust or bylines in newspapers that you can trust, I think you'll continue to turn to those sources, whether you're 18, 34, or 61. I don't think it matters. But I think we've spent too much time getting lost in this idea that our anchors have to be something other than journalists. They have to be guests on Letterman. They have to be guests on Jimmy Kimmel. They have to be guests on The Daily Show. And as I said, Ron McDonald said it best to me 25 years ago, that it's really, journalism is in a sad state when reporters are interviewing other reporters. And it's even in a sadder state when 3 million people on election night heard who the new president was from a comedian. 3.1 million people heard from Jon Stewart on election night that Barack Obama was elected president. 6.5 million people heard from Katie Couric that Barack Obama was elected president. Think about it. That's twice as many, but you could look at it the other way, that half as many people who heard from a journalist heard who our new president was from a comedian. First time I think that's ever happened. I think there are a couple of things that you can do. We've talked about it in our class. You need to give people a combination of what they need to know and also what they want to know. And we're dealing right now with a lot of audience-driven content that if you watch critically or closely an evening newscast right now, usually the first 12 minutes will cover the news of the day, and it's roughly an 18 to 19-minute news whole. The remaining 6 to 7 minutes are spent giving people things that entertain them or provide them with information that they want to know, not necessarily that they need to know. As long, especially on the television side of things, you have a product that's being judged by an entertainment standard, ratings, you're going to have to play that game to a certain point. But television news played that game to a certain point for a very long time very successfully. And you can do that by convincing people, and I think good journalism can do this, by convincing people that what they need to know is also what they want to know. And there's nothing wrong with doing the good feature story and end the newscast or write the good style section piece for the paper or the web. There's nothing wrong with that. That's an important part of journalism. But at the same time, I think if we give people a good, solid news product, pretty soon they will have trouble distinguishing between what it is they need to know and what they want to know. But it will always be something that, when you're in the news business, will always be something that you will have to look at very carefully and look at in a way that says, yes, I need to do this, but I also need to do this. And so my advice would be, make sure you always have the lead story so people know what they need to know, because they won't stick around to find out what they want to know if you don't give them what they need to know. And there's also nothing wrong in news coverage with putting a personal face on a story. I mean, it was said to me many, many years ago that sometimes the best way to get to the heart of a story is to tell the story that touches the heart. And so we can do things in our reporting that make our stories entertaining and informative at the same time. So I don't think they have to be exclusive. Bill? Bill and Bill. Bill, take Bill first. Bill in the back. It's happened first and foremost because it's the easiest way to go. The standards in most news organizations in the 1980s and even into the early 1990s said if you used anonymous sources, there had to be more than one anonymous source, and that those sources had to be known not only to the reporter but also to his or her editor. That's no longer the standard in most news organizations right now. I'm convinced that in many news organizations today, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but that many anonymous sources are not sources at all. That they're things that are heard at cocktail parties, and they're things that are picked up on the internet, and that there are rumors and innuendo that are making their way into stories as anonymous sources. Or there are anonymous sources, but there is some liberty taking beyond what the anonymous source has provided with what eventually ends up in the news product. And as I said, I'm embarrassed to say that. I have no confirmation to tell you that that's a fact. I will tell you that the reason I believe that is that a lot of reporting, which turned out to be faulty reporting based on anonymous sources, was matched by other news organizations based on anonymous sources. That's where I'm coming from. Bill?
So is there anything that you can point to that the landscape that journalists do better?
I think there's a lot that we do better. I think we tell better stories. With all deference to Charles Kuralt, I think that we have used technology, we have used the tools available to us to tell more interesting stories, and I think we've used the technology to allow us to tell stories from places that we haven't been able to tell them before. It's now, when I said in response to the one question about the disappearance of international news bureaus, what's happening now is that places like your network, ABC, the foreign correspondents now are digital journalists. They're not much older than the students here at WNL, who come armed with the types of talents that you all have, and they are taking us to places now that we didn't go before because the union contract said you had to have a cameraman, you had to have a sound technician, you had to have a producer, you had to have a correspondent, you had to have a tape editor. Now they're doing it all with one, and I think that does give some benefit to the product, and it allows us to see things that we wouldn't normally see. I think we are doing a much better job of covering big events like 9/11 that I think we've seen, as you saw with the shooting at Virginia Tech, that the most difficult story for any journalist to cover is a story that affects that journalist or happens in the community where you work. 9/11 ushered us into an era, I think, where every story now that we cover is in our community. And I think we're doing, as news organizations, I think we are doing a better job of covering news as it happens, big news as it happens. And we, I think, have to give a lot of credit to the cable news organizations for that. They have really refined that to the point that we're doing that better than the networks covered, say, for example, the Kennedy assassination or other events back in the 1960s, the 1970s, or even the 1980s.
Please join me in thanking